Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, we got a great show for you today. I'm very excited about today's show. You may have seen the graphic. You may have seen the marketing that says this is the 150th episode of God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And if you're watching it right now, this moment, I am broadcasting live on Facebook, my Facebook page, God Save the King Facebook page, also on the Truth Be Told Radio Network Facebook page, and we're also on X on the Truth Be Told Radio Network right now, live a little bit after 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 5th. Now, the regular broadcast time for my show is 10 p.m. on Fridays. So every Friday at 10 p.m. on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, you can catch my show, because I don't always do this live on Wednesday. Lately, I've been doing it live on Wednesday, but I don't always do that. Sometimes I just record it and it goes out on my regularly scheduled broadcast time, which is 10 p.m. on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Now, if you want to catch my show, there are good ways to do it. Number one, if you prefer a video format, our preferred platform is Rumble. So you can catch God Save the King on Rumble by simply going to Rumble and then in the search bar putting in Truth Be Told Radio Network and then looking for God Save the King. If you prefer a podcast format, simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and then just simply click on the podcast tab, and you will see the icons for all of the major podcast platforms that we are a part of. And we are adding additional podcast platforms all the time. So I highly encourage you that if that's your preferred method, then that's how you access it, right? And then last but certainly not least, there is the audio format, the radio format, which is simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, click on the Listen Live button. But what you can also do, and this is funny because this happens pretty much every episode now, because I have my phone sitting right there. I don't know why. I should probably put it across the room someplace so that it doesn't interfere with me recording my show. But when we get to this part of the show, this is always funny, because if you have a smart device, and smart devices include your phone, right? And smart devices include the in-home speakers, the Google speaker, the Apple speaker, things like that. You can say, "Hey Siri, play Truth Be Told Radio Network." Now watch this. Here's my phone is Siri is trying to respond to my request, So she'll probably say something here in a minute, like,
for your iPhone 11.
Yeah, did she?
It's nearby. Pinging your iPhone 11 now.
She doesn't understand, okay, my request. So, but anyway, that's how you do that. Yeah, she's pinging my phone. Stop, Siri, stop. Okay.
There's nothing to stop here. Check if the device.
Too funny, isn't it? Anyway, let's talk about God Save the King, right? So we got a great show for you today. We are going to continue the conversation that we have been having, entitled, "Where Did Cain's Wife Come From?" Where did Cain get his wife? This has been one of the ultimate biblical head scratchers for decades and generations, simply because the Bible really doesn't say. When you're reading the record in Genesis 4 and you read about Cain and Abel and you read about the very sordid tale of the first murder in the Bible, and then, God delivers his judgment to Cain, all of a sudden out of nowhere it says, "And Cain knew his wife, and she bore a son, and that he named his son Enoch, and then he built a city, and he named the city for his son Enoch," right? And there it is. It's just out of nowhere. Cain knew his wife, right? The quaint King James language there. Cain knew his wife. But it's really interesting because we're never told, "And Cain chose himself a wife from the daughters of so-and-so," which is common in the book of Genesis, and yet we're not told this here. So it's like I said, it's the ultimate biblical head scratcher, and it's been that way for a long time. Where did Cain get his wife? Because the presumption is, wait a second, time out, think about it. It has a form of logic. If Adam and Eve were the first two human beings, and they have a son named Cain, they got a son named Abel, eventually they have a son named Seth. And then in Genesis 5, we are told that Adam and Eve had sons and daughters. Well, isn't it axiomatic then that for the first generation minimum, maybe even the second or third generation, that they had to intermarry with brothers and sisters? It kind of seems that way, right? So that is the common answer that is frequently thrown out there, but I'm going to suggest to you that there's an alternative, and the alternative may make people uncomfortable, right? But what we have also been talking, so this is part 2 of answering the question, where did Cain get his wife? But it's part 4 of my series entitled, Is Genesis Myth? Is Genesis myth? So bear with me a second while I click here, because I am my own producer. So let's get this up over here. There we go. So this is the definition of myth that we have been using. Myth is an ancient, non-fictional, sacred traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it, but told in poetic, primordial language. So I have been using this definition for several episodes now. So to answer the question, is Genesis myth? I am going to say yes, based upon that definition. Now, I'm going to get a lot of people who don't agree with that definition. That's fine. You're free to disagree. And there's going to be a lot of people that don't like the fact that I am calling Genesis myth, because they think that I am saying that Genesis is fiction. And I am not saying that. Calling it myth does not mean I'm calling it fiction. Myth, the modern definition of myth, is fiction. The ancient definition of myth is not fiction, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But this is what we have been talking about for several episodes now, because scholars have agreed for quite some time that the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are not traditional historical narrative. That starts in Genesis 12. Genesis 12 starts a very traditional historical narrative kind of format, but not before that. Genesis 1 through 11 is different, and scholars have recognized that for a long time. The key here is in how we are articulating what it is we're talking about, because if you can articulate it well, then it makes sense. But if you don't articulate it well, this can be a real puzzle. I mean, and not in a good way. It can be really difficult to understand certain things and really easy to miscommunicate if you cannot articulate this well, because the first 11 chapters of Genesis are like a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. They really are. They are a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, and there are concepts and ideas that are hidden in the text, which we're going to talk about, that are hidden in the text that, I mean, they are huge concepts, and they're all packed into like 1 or 2 sentences. It happens right here in Genesis 4. You know, we talked about this last time. Not only where did Cain get his wife, but then Cain also makes the statement in light of God's judgment. He says, wherever I go, whoever finds me will want to kill me. Okay, wait, stop, wait, who are you talking about? What do you mean whoever finds you will try to kill you? Aren't Adam and Eve the only 2 humans, and their children the only humans on earth? So what are you talking about your little brother? That you just killed Abel, but now you've got another other members of your family, if they find it, it's tough. This is very challenging. These are legitimate questions, and what we're trying to do is sort it out a bit, right? So what I want to do is I do want to review what we talked about last time. I want to burn through it pretty much as quickly as I can so that we can get to new information today and talk about the fact that there are alternatives on how we can look at this. But what we have lacked, what we have lacked is we have lacked the proper articulation, the proper perspective, and the proper articulation to communicate what it is we're doing and what we're looking at and things like that. And it all starts with this notion that Genesis 1 through 11 is not necessarily to be understood as literal. Now, that doesn't mean that some portions of it are not, that some sentences, some paragraphs are not supposed to be literal, but not necessarily the whole thing. This is the way ancient history was written. Modern history tends to be written in a very analytical style, but ancient history tends to be written in a figurative, poetic, and symbolic style. And therefore, if we try to understand ancient history by looking through a modern viewfinder, that's where we're going to run into problems. So that is why I am emphasizing and re-emphasizing the fact that Genesis 1 through 11 is written in this mytho-poetic language. That is the context of Genesis 1 through 11, and that is how we have to understand it. So you can go back to last week's episode, even the episode before that, and watch those, listen to those, and you'll get a lot of what I'm talking about here, because we defined what the word myth means, okay? Ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the church, or pardon me, the culture church, the culture or nation that embraces it, but told in poetic primordial language. We define the word poetic, that it means colorful, embellished, things like that. That's what poetic means. We define primordial. Primordial means to start from the beginning. And we talked about the word literal, that the word literal is a buzzword that gets misinterpreted all the time. Okay, because people think that the literal method of biblical interpretation means that you're taking it literally 100% of the time, and it doesn't mean that. The literal method of biblical interpretation, which is sometimes called the historical method of interpretation, simply means you're using the normal rules of language, and the normal rules of language include figurative language that is not literal. So the point being is that just because it isn't literal doesn't make it fiction. Just because it isn't literal doesn't make it fiction. Just because it is mythopoetic doesn't make it fiction. See, and this does not affect, for those of us that are Bible-believing, quote-unquote, conservative, evangelical, Orthodox Christians, and all of those with not capital E evangelical, lowercase evangelical, not capital O Orthodox, lowercase Orthodox, conservative, Orthodox, evangelical, Bible-believing Christians. This does not affect the inerrancy of Scripture, the authority of Scripture, the sufficiency of Scripture, the perspicuity of Scripture, or the historicity of Scripture. It doesn't affect it. It's just simply saying it's poetic. It's not literal. That doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean that it's not true. So our text, of course, is Genesis 4, verses 16 and 17. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. There it is. Where did his wife come from? Out of nowhere? Like I said, the text doesn't even tell us, and Cain took a wife from the daughters of so-and-so. It doesn't say. So this is very important. I stressed this last time. The text does not say. Where did Cain get his wife? The text does not say. That's actually very important for how we operate as interpreters of Scripture. It's very important to state clearly what the text does and does not say. And then once you have stated what the text does and does not say, then you can start to draw answers from the extended context. See, because the text does not say where Cain got his wife. It doesn't say, right? Now, like I said, there is a form of logic. The common logic is, well, Adam and Eve were the only two humans. All humans descended from them. Therefore, axiomatically, Cain must have married another one of Adam and Eve's children because this would be necessary for the multiplication of the species. It would have been absolutely necessary. So a lot of people consider this axiomatic. But there are problems. This creates more questions and problems than it does answers, not the least of which are the genetic disorder challenge, right? Because if you've got inbreeding, aren't you going to have genetic disorders? And then also the challenge of, well, what about the moral prohibition against incest? So these are the challenges, but then there's rebuttals to the challenges, and then there's rebuttals to the rebuttals of the challenges, and it just keeps getting into this, as I described it last week, a box of coat hangers, right? It becomes this gnarled mess. So what I'm here to suggest is that there is another possibility. Now, I'm not saying which one is true. This could still be true. It could be that Cain married his sister. Okay, but I'm also going to suggest to you that there's another alternative based upon the context, because that is what we are doing right now, is we are working on drawing answers out of the context. And where we left off last time is I actually shared with you the etymology of the word context, because the word context, I throw it around all the time. I talk about how important it is. And the etymology of the word context is actually, in my opinion, very, very fascinating, because it's a compound word of com plus text. Com means together, and then text means the text, right? So, and the root word, however, of text means to weave or to build, which is very provocative because it means the context, therefore, is multiple ideas woven together or multiple ideas built together into a fabric or a building, which is very provocative because if you weave multiple threads, multiple ideas together into a fabric, isn't it interesting that that is called a textile? Right? So the word text, the root word for text in Latin and in Greek, means either a written page, or it also means a fabric, or it also means to build. Very interesting. And there's an ancient proverb that says, hey, the talented storyteller can do what's called spin a yarn. But spin a yarn means to take several threads and twist them into a larger thread. But it's the poet who weaves a tapestry that becomes a visual picture of what is going on. So isn't it interesting that the ancient concept of history was poetic, and that they believed they were weaving a visual tapestry out of abstract ideas? See, so once again, modern history is analytical in nature, but ancient history is figurative and poetic and symbolic in nature. And what we can't do is we cannot take our modern viewfinder, our modern mindset, our modern worldview, and then superimpose it over the top of an ancient book, because Genesis is an ancient book. See, and if it's an ancient book, you got to read it like it's an ancient book. You can't read it like it's a modern book, because it's not, right? So that's where we left off last time, was understanding the etymology of what context is. And context means the whole story or the whole picture. So you have to understand each individual point in the context, in the larger context, which is why, context is king. That if you have ever been to Bible college, you have been taught that context means everything, right? So now I'm repeating myself, but let's build the case here. We are talking about ancient history, not modern history. Ancient history is more figurative, poetic, symbolic. Modern history is analytical. We cannot superimpose our modern ideas on an ancient text because Genesis is ancient history, not modern history. We can't superimpose that. So what you've got to do is you got to ask yourself, what would the writer of Genesis and the intended audience of Genesis, what would they have been thinking? Because think about how many websites there are out there, how many websites, how many ministries, etc., that talk about science in Genesis. Science in Genesis, okay? Well, was Moses thinking about science when he was writing this? I don't think so. Was Moses's intended audience thinking about science when Moses delivered it? I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean we can't maybe glean some scientific information, but if we are superimposing our modern scientific analytical viewfinder over the top of this, that's not going to work. You're going to miss it because you're missing the context, okay? And once again, back to this word myth. Myth was how things were understood. This mythopoetic primordial language, because what this was is these were stories in different cultures about divine beings, right? They were generally arranged in a coherent system and they were revered as true and sacred, which is why I say they are nonfiction. Now, we know, here you go. Now, this is where things get a little complicated. We do know through some modern analytical concepts that certain myths from the ancient world may not be literally true, but that's missing the point. The point is that regardless of whether it's the Bible or whether it's Virgil's Aeneid or Homer's Iliad or whether it's the the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Babylonian mythology, they were revered as sacred and true. The writers believed it was true. It was mythopoetic historical knowledge that they believed was true. Okay, so we can't. It works against us to try to change the definition and then misrepresent it and say that, well, it's myth, it's not true, right? And see, this was what I am sharing with you was the standard definition of mythology until the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so only 150, 175 years ago, that's what the word myth would have meant, and people would have understood it, right? See, so myth has its authority not by proving itself. The old school thinking about myth is that myth doesn't have to prove itself. It just presents itself. It is, here you go, it is self-evident. That's where we get that phrase from, is that the ancients believed that certain truths were self-evident. Okay, so that all you got to do is look. Anybody with a brain, anybody with two eyes can look and go, oh, yep, that's true. See? So very interesting. See, so from a certain perspective, see, sacred, and when you think about it, it was deemed sacred. Okay, well, if you're a Bible believer, okay, it is sacred. So if it's sacred, it doesn't have to prove itself. Okay, now that doesn't mean it can't and won't, because it does many times. Okay, but that's why I keep re-emphasizing certain facts here, is we have got to understand it in the context in which it was written and not the context that we superimpose, right? So is Genesis myth? Depending upon your definition of the word myth, yes, it is, right? So what we run the risk of is redefining what the word myth means so that we can invalidate or reject what we don't agree with. But that is not good research. That's not good research at all. If you want to research what these books really said and meant and things like that, you've got to do it the right way. Now, I mentioned earlier that Genesis, especially the first 11 chapters, are almost like a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. So I want to share something with you here. Bear with me while I get the screen share up here. I want to share this with you. This is a clever saying that I heard a long time ago. I heard this a long time ago, and it's really true. If you're reading the early chapters of Genesis and you're not confused, you are not paying close enough attention. Okay, because this is the context of what's going on. This is a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where you have, it's a tapestry, it is a woven tapestry where you've got threads running through it, and every one of those threads is a very significant idea in and among itself. So I'm going to refer back to this idea from time to time, that if you're reading the early chapters of Genesis and you're not confused, you're simply not paying close enough attention. If you think you've got the early chapters of Genesis nailed down and that you can explain them, right? You can't. I mean, every time I engage this concept and take a deeper look at Genesis, it blows me away every single time. So let's continue talking about this. What I want to move on to now is I want to talk about establishing the context in this sense. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Well, the book of Genesis was written by Moses. Okay. Now, there is some debate over whether that's true or not, but according to the Bible, frankly, according to Jesus himself, Moses wrote the Pentateuch. He wrote the Torah. You've got Jesus in the Gospels citing or quoting Moses from all 5 books of the Torah. So you've got Jesus himself stating that Moses wrote the Torah. Now that is, it's not explicit. You don't get Jesus saying Moses wrote the Torah, just like you don't have a statement that says Cain's wife came from XYZ. But when you've got Moses citing Genesis 1 and 2 and saying from the beginning God created them male and female, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and join unto his wife, you've got Moses citing and quoting the book of Genesis, right? And you've got places where where Jesus says, have you not read in the law of Moses, right? So that is drawing out of the context. It's not explicit, it is implicit, but that's what drawing out of the context looks like, okay? This is important because who wrote Genesis? Moses wrote Genesis. Now, when did Moses write it? There's a couple of different theories. The most common one is that he wrote it during the 3rd quarter of the 2nd millennium BC. During the 3rd quarter of the 2nd millennium BC. So in other words, somewhere between about 1500 and 1200 BC is when Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay. Now, who is his intended audience? His intended audience is the Hebrew nation that he is leading out of Egypt to the promised land. That's what he's doing. He is telling them the myth, the mythopoetic history of their nation. He's telling them where they come from. Remember our definition, right? Remember our definition. Let's go back there. Remember the definition we were working with, the definition of myth, right? Myth is an ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it. So that is what Moses is doing, is he is teaching the fledgling nation of Israel their foundation and their identity, and he's doing it in poetic, primordial language. So this isn't a problem. This is what Moses is doing. And there are statements in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, where it talks about that Moses is telling them this story so that they can go into the land and possess the land. That's the point. He's telling them the story so that they know what to do. They know what their history is. and they know what their destiny is. So Moses is the author, Moses is the writer or the storyteller, right? And his audience is the fledgling nation of Israel. And what he is doing is he is declaring to them the mythopoetic story of their origin and their mission and their destiny. So this is very important in light of establishing the context. So what is the context of Genesis? The context is that you've got an ancient Hebrew prophet, an ancient Hebrew storyteller communicating the origin story of the Hebrew nation to a Hebrew audience in the form of ancient Hebrew storytelling. And as you can see on the graphic here, I wrote in that the Department of Redundancy department is intended. Okay, I am being redundant for a reason. This is a Hebrew storyteller telling his audience is a Hebrew audience, and he is telling the story of the origin, mission, and destiny of the Hebrew nation, and he's doing it in a fashion. Here you go. He's doing it in a fashion that they will understand. So you want one of the key components of understanding the context of Genesis. You've got to ask yourself, how would Moses and his audience have understood this? How would Moses and his audience have understood this, right? So one of the things we're going to talk about here in a minute is that if you go into the Hebraic grammar, the Hebrew grammar of Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, you learn some very interesting things, which means it would have meant something to both Moses and his audience that it doesn't necessarily mean to us, because not only are we not, generally speaking, Hebrew speakers, we're not Hebrew thinkers. We don't think the way they thought. And if you want to understand context and you want to understand the Bible, we do have to learn to think the way they thought and go, okay, what would this have meant to Moses and to his intended audience? Interesting, right? Very interesting. Then, like I said, combined with the fact that you've got Jesus citing and quoting Moses. Because now if you're a follower of Jesus, if you are a Christian, right, now that is Jesus authorizing Moses. See, so if this is our sacred story, it's the story that we believe, right? And we believe in the integrity and the authority and the inerrancy of Scripture. Then see, now it all starts to fit together and start to make sense. And this is, frankly, how we need to be able to articulate it so it can make sense to others. Because some of us don't do that so well. We don't really answer these questions properly. We lack the articulation, right? See, because the Gospels, they are much more of a standard historical narrative, right? In general, they are much more of a standard historical narrative. But we also know, see, that Jesus spoke in various forms of figurative language, especially parables, right? Jesus told lots and lots and lots of parables. Isn't that interesting that he spoke in parables? Well, that's because he's trying to communicate this multi-dimensional truth that is easier to communicate in a story than it is in an analytical fashion. You need that poetic, figurative, symbolic storytelling element to paint the picture, to create the fabric, to create the textile, right? So that people can see the picture. Okay, they can see the picture. So let's talk about an illustration of this from American history that we can understand. And some of you may know this, but there's going to be a lot of you that don't. So bear with me for 1 second here. I want to talk about the Battle of Baltimore. Now, if you don't know what the Battle of Baltimore was, it was a battle during the War of 1812. And what happened was the British were attacking the Americans. They'd actually burned the White House just a few weeks earlier, and now they're attacking the port and the city of Baltimore, right? They're attacking the port, by sea using the Navy, and then they're attacking the city by land. Now, thankfully, jumping ahead here, the Americans won the battle, but it was pretty scary there for a minute because the Brits really went after the Americans both by land and by sea. Now, what was interesting is that there was an American attorney who had a friend who was taken captive by the British. And what he did is he went to the British to negotiate the release of his friend, right? And they had these things called truce ships. Okay, these were ships that were in the harbor, right, where you would go aboard the ship, and that's where you would conduct your negotiations aboard one of these truce ships. And when you were aboard a truce ship, you were untouchable, right? Those were the rules of engagement back then, is that when you're on a truce ship, you can't be touched, right? But also what's going on is that the Navy is bombarding Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, right? So even though this man and his friend are aboard this truce ship, the British won't let them go, okay? Temporarily. They say, we will let you go. We're going to let you go tomorrow or the next day or whatever. We will let you go. We just can't let you go right now because the battle is going on. And number one, you might get killed, and that doesn't look good from a truce ship, right? Because you can't be touched. Right. And then also, we also can't let you go because you're going to run back to the Americans and you're going to tell them what's going on. So legitimate reasons why they're not letting them go. But the point being is that this attorney and his friend watched the bombardment of Fort McHenry overnight from this British truce ship, and the bombardment was intense. So they were very concerned when they got up in the morning to wonder if Fort McHenry was still standing or whether the British had pounded it into dust, right? But they got up in the morning, and what they saw that gave them tremendous relief was that all through the night, the Americans had flown a very large American flag over the fort. And when they saw the flag still standing, they knew that the fort was still standing and that it was likely that the Americans had won the battle. So now you've probably put it all together now. I'm telling you the story of the Star-Spangled Banner, okay? So the attorney, was Francis Scott Key, and from his vantage point, watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry from a truce ship, he wrote a poem entitled The Defense of Fort McHenry, and then that was put to music years later, and it became the Star-Spangled Banner, which is now the national anthem of the United States. My point is this: it's poetry, and yet it is a poetic description of the Battle of Baltimore. In other words, it is a poetic description of an historical event. It's not literal, it's not analytical, it's poetic, and it's figurative, and it's symbolic, and it's absolutely true. It's not fiction. It's poetry and it's history at the same time. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. See? Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that's just the first verse. That's just the first stanza. But look, I put this out last time. I can use the word sunset to describe the sunset, or I can call the sunset the twilight's last gleaming. One is very plain, one is very poetic. Neither one of them is untrue. See? So this is what we have to gain from our understanding of Genesis, is that just because it's poetic does not mean it is untrue. Just because it's poetic and not literal does not mean that it is fiction. Oh yeah, by the way, I re-listened to last week's episode, I did slip that phrase at least once, maybe even twice, where I slipped and I used the word fiction when I meant nonfiction. So you might go back and watch that and figure that out. So now that I've said all of this and I've taken all this time, because in order to draw answers from context, we got to understand what the context is. If you don't understand what the context is, then see, you're going to miss it. And let's put this back up here. Here, let me get to my screen share and let's put this back up. Doop, 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 doop. Bing, 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 bing. Well, here, let's do this one. Similar but different, okay? Who is the storyteller? A Hebrew prophet named Moses. Who is the intended audience? The fledgling nation of Israel. When was it written? As Israel is about to enter the promised land. What is the literary method? Ancient, Near Eastern, Hebrew, mythopoetic, historic storytelling. Okay, see, it's an ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture and nation, that embraces it, but told in poetic, primordial language. See, and so now if we go back to this one, right, the one I call the prime directive, essentially the same thing. Moses is the ancient Hebrew storyteller communicating the origin story of the Hebrew nation to an ancient Hebrew audience in the form of ancient Hebrew storytelling. Look at the last line. Miss the context and you miss everything. See? So we've got to ask ourselves, this is Moses telling the story to the Hebrew nation. How would they have understood it? How would they have understood it? So now let's talk about Hebrew for a second. Because in Hebrew, in the book of Genesis, you have the Hebrew word Adam, right? And the Hebrew word Adam, okay, means man, or it's translated man. It's also translated Adam. It's also translated as a proper name, okay? Both are correct. Neither one is incorrect. See, there you go, right? See, we're already playing with this threshold. You've got a Hebrew word that has multiple nuanced meanings, okay? And which one is the one that's in view? Okay, does it mean man? Does it mean human? Does it mean Adam? Right? Now, when the Hebrew word Adam has the definite article on the front, ha-Adam, okay, the definite article means the word the, right? Ha-Adam is the man, the man. Whenever you have the definite article on the front like that, what it is not is it's not a proper name. It's the man, or better would even be humanity, or the human race, or mankind. Okay, those would be better translations of the two-word phrase ha-Adam than translating it Adam, because under those circumstances, it is not a proper name. So it is not appropriate. This is very important. It is not appropriate to translate ha-Adam, Adam. It's not appropriate to translate that phrase as a proper name. The reason this is so important is because in Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's only found with the definite article. Adam is never used as a proper name until Genesis 5. There, it is used as a proper name. You run into the word Adam, and it is appropriately translated Adam. But every time before that, it is ha-Adam and should be translated the man, or humanity, or the human race, or mankind. Okay, or maybe man, the man, right? The male, maybe, right? More often than not, it should be humanity, right? Now, in addition, the Hebrew words bara, asa, and yatsar, which are all found in Genesis 1 and 2, bara is translated create, asa is translated to make, and yatsar is translated formed. All of these are very difficult to reduce down and translate into English, okay? And what we do is we take our modern viewfinder and we try to make these words analytical and scientific in nature when, according to Hebrew grammar, they're not really. They're not analytical and scientific in nature. They are figurative in nature. So what they do not do is they do not denote material creation. Okay, yeah, you heard me right. They do not denote material creation. They denote functional creation. And to illustrate that, let's talk about buying a house and then remodeling a house. See, I used to work in the construction industry, so this is an illustration that makes tons of sense to me. It should make plenty of sense to you, even if you've never actually remodeled a house yourself, right? Either done the work or owned a home that was remodeled. But if you have a new owner of a house, right, and they go into the house and they look at this room over here and they go, well, that the former owner used that room as a formal dining room. We don't really need a formal dining room, but what we do really need is we need a playroom for the kids. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to take that wall and we're going to move it over there, and we're going to move the electric, and we're going to move the plumbing, and we're going to install this and move that, and then we're going to redecorate it and repaint it, and we're going to bring in furniture that is appropriate for the new function of the room. Well, what have you done? You have created a playroom for the kids. Now, you didn't create it out of nothing. You created it out of pre-existing materials, but you did create. And contrary to what many of our analytical thinkers have been telling us about the Hebrew language, that's not what these words mean. They can mean it, but in context, this is about functional creation, not necessarily material creation. Functional creation, not necessarily material creation. And the reason this is important is because when you understand that Adam is not a proper name when it is used in the early chapters of Genesis, this means when you read something like Genesis 1:26, right? God created humanity in his image, not God created man. See, because whether we realize it or not, we tend to substitute Adam, the person. We tend to substitute the person because, see, here it is. We've heard these stories so many times, and this is directly related to my work with God Save the King and the Nativity, right? I shared with you last episode before, that I was deeply considering nativity scenes and the fact that we have these figurines that we make, right? And that depending upon, and it's funny because they even have contests around the world for people to manufacture a nativity scene. And a lot of them, I poke fun at it on my website every Christmas, where you have nativity scenes made out of unique materials that are culturally relevant to the location in which they are made. But that can be problematic, okay? Because the biblical story is culturally relevant to the Hebrew culture, straight up. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean we can't glean from it. It doesn't mean it's not a story that communicates to humanity, right? Because it can and does, but it's a Hebrew story. Okay. I bang on this all the time. The Nativity is not a Christian story. It's not. I'm sorry if you don't like it, but it's not. It's not a Christian story. No one in the Nativity story is a Christian. Everybody, not everybody, but the main characters of the Nativity story are Jewish. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are Jewish. The shepherds are Jewish. Now, the Magi, they're Gentiles. They are Parthians coming from the Parthian Empire. But the Nativity story is not a Christian story. It's a Jewish story. It's a Hebrew story. Okay? So likewise, the creation story that is in Genesis, that is being told by Moses, by a Hebrew prophet to a Hebrew audience, is also a Hebrew story. Right? Now, like I said, Jesus cites Moses in the Gospels. So if you are a follower of Jesus, then Jesus has authenticated and validated the stories told by Moses, which is why now we can adopt, okay, the mythology of ancient Israel. It becomes our story as well, because I'm a follower of Jesus of Nazareth who authenticates the story of Moses. See? So this is very important when we go back and look at Genesis 1 and 2, is because Adam is not a proper name most of the time. But what we have done is in all, see, here we go. This is where we're connecting it. In all the stories that we have told, we substitute Adam for whenever we read the man. We think Adam because that's what we've been told. Okay? All the different graphics and all the different felt boards and all the different children's stories and stuff like that that have a man and a woman and a snake and an apple, right? And we need to stop and slow down and rethink what this is, because it's figurative, it's symbolic, it's epic poetry, it's epic Hebrew poetry, and it says God created humanity in his image. Now, male and female, he created them. Yeah, he did. That's true. Okay, he created the male and female. But it's humanity, right? It doesn't mean necessarily the persons Adam and Eve, because, by the way, Adam means humanity, and Hava, Eve, means life. So together they're human life. They're humanity, right? So what I'm suggesting here, I don't know that this is absolutely true. I haven't made up my mind yet. But what I'm suggesting to you is an alternative to the Cain married his sister story. The alternative that I'm suggesting to you is that there were other people, and lots of them. And that Adam and Eve, who I believe were literal people, there's that word again, right? I do believe that Adam and Eve were real people, that they were literal people elected by God to caretake the garden, to caretake the sacred space. In other words, to effectively be priests of the geophysical location where heaven and earth intersect. Okay? But that doesn't mean that every time we read Ha-Adam, that it means the man Adam, the individual Adam. Because once again, it's figurative, it's poetic, it's symbolic, it's epic, it's a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. And it really, truly is. So what I'm suggesting to you is that there are alternatives to believing that Cain married his sister. When Cain goes and lives in Nod to the east of Eden, he could have very easily found someone else. And that's what Scripture suggests. That is actually what the context suggests. Likewise, same with wherever I go, whoever finds me will kill me. Okay? Because now the whoever is actually whoever. Because what's being suggested there, which we'll talk about another time, is revenge. That they're going to kill him because he killed his brother. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, we do have to wrap it up. My name is Tim Kise. You have been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me next week as we continue the discussion of Is Genesis Myth on God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God Save the King.